Okay, good morning, all students and my dear colleague, ada Ibu Orin. My name is Ira from International Department. Thank you for joining us today in the event of sharing session of the alumni. It is one of the activity under the International Department and Indonesian Center for International Law, Faculty of Law, Padjadjaran University. Today's issue will be about the International Refugee Law, Indonesian Practice, and the role of UNHCR. It is an honor that today one of our alumni, Kang Isa Soemawidjaja, SHLLM, will share his knowledge and experience working with refugee issues. Welcome, Kang Isa. Thank you for spare your time with us. Glad to welcome you back in our campus through online platform, or should I say Wilujeng Sumping. Sugeng Rawuh, saya tahunya Sugeng Rawuh. I have practiced with Ibu Orin. Welcome, Kang Isa. Thank you. And I will read Kang Isa's CV shortly. First of all, allow me to give an introduction remark on what we are going to discuss this morning. First of all, the position of international refugee course in our faculty, it is over in master program, but not in bachelor program. It is a compulsory course for students who's taking international law specialization in the second semester. And for bachelor student, the refugee issue is included in discussion of AHL course. If we talk about human movement or human migration, it is already becomes a common phenomenon nowadays. People are moving across the border for many reasons, avoiding persecution in their home country, looking for a better living condition, looking for a better employment, and many motives behind the movement. As for refugee, to gain protection under international law, they should fulfill some of requirements, like owing a well-founded fear of being persecuted for the reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of particular social group or political opinion, outside its country of origin, and also unwilling to avail him or herself protection from that country. So initially, refugee criteria can be found in 1951 Refugee Convention with geographical and time limitation. But the New York Protocol in 1967 has been lifted this limitation. It is not that a person who fulfill the criteria of the statute of the UNHCR is qualified for the protection of the UN provided by the UNHCR. It is immaterial whether or not he is in a country of that is a party to a refugee convention or the protocol, or whether or not his host country recognize him as refugee under any of these instruments. Such refugee being within the UNHCR mandate are usually known as a mandate refugee. In practice, the movement of people from one region to another region in the world is not as easy as imagined. Of course, everyone freedom of movement is limited by the immigration regulation in each country. Sometimes refugees who come from conflict areas bring no identity documents, which will be a problem when they enter into one country. Not to mention that sometimes these refugees use very dangerous means of transportation, using simple boats with overload capacity to shell the ocean, which certainly endangering their own life. Additional problem will arise when, for example, the transit country of the refugee is not the signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention, or the refugee should wait in transit country for an extended period for the process of refugee status determination. As for Indonesia, since the late 90s, Indonesia has been a major transit point for refugees from Central Asia, South Asia, in the Middle East, and road to Australia. However, increasing strict border controls in Australia, most recently Operation Sovereign Borders, has forced growing numbers of refugees to take up residence in our country in Indonesia. I read from the report that in February 2016, UNHCR documented around 30,000 refugee and asylum seekers in Indonesia. While overall numbers remain small in global terms, but this increases more than 30% from 2013. Indonesia is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, though since 1979 it has permitted UNHCR to operate an office in Indonesia. Historically, Indonesian government has refused to accept local integration, and resettlement comes with a long wait. Refugee status determination alone can take about 20 months, while in contrast, UNHCR reportedly informed refugees that they should expect to wait 6 years before relocating. In addition, there is no specific regulation that guarantees the right of refugee in Indonesia. There is one instrument, Perpres number 125 in 2016, about handling refugee from abroad. But this regulation still raises some problems too, since it's considered that the regulation only regulates a technical issue, but not guaranteeing the basic right of refugee. So there are still many issues related to refugee in Indonesia, particularly that we can discuss this morning with Kang Isa. We can discuss about how's the condition of refugee in Indonesia, what are the problems of their presence in Indonesia, what are the role of UNHCR in Indonesia, how they conduct refugee status determination in Indonesia, and is there any problem dealing with refugee in particular? So this is what we are going to discuss this morning. So we are so lucky to have Kang Isa for today's discussion. Allow me to read his short CV. Kang Isa, hold on. Okay, Kang Isa was from class 2001. He graduated in 2005 and then taking his LL.M or Master of Law from School of Law, University of Essex. And he is an expert in refugee issues since he has been working with UNHCR for years. He has experience as a RSD officer for many years in many places like in Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, and many places. And he has a lot of experience. So we certainly will get some information and some enlightenment from his presentation today. So without further ado, please welcome Kang Isa.
Okay, thank you, Taira. Very good morning to everyone. A bit nervous because I know many people on the same call here, Kang Imam, Teh Is, Teh Christy, Teh Orin. So it's always good to be back in UNPAD, although this time it's only on a computer. I hope that my presentation will give a little bit information about how the international refugee law is being enforced and practiced in Indonesia, but also to inspire you, maybe that you would also consider to choose the same career path after graduating from UNPAD. So not all UNPAD law graduates will just go to law firms in Jakarta, but also you could be, humanitarian workers like myself, but still working in the field of international refugee law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. So I understand that I have been given around 2 hours, and maybe my presentation will be only around less than an hour. So this will allow everyone to have more time to have a question and answer session. If you allow me, could I just share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation ready for this session.
Yes, you may share now.
Okay, thank you, Teh Orin. Okay, just wanted to check whether you see my screen right now.
Yes.
Okay, so I would like to start my presentation by sharing you a short story. I don't know if any one of you is aware about who this lady is. If not, then I will just briefly tell you about who she is. So she is a teacher, she is an educator, an education advocate, humanitarian worker, and also most importantly, she's a refugee. She's an Afghan refugee, one of those 1.4 million Afghan refugees who are currently being hosted in Pakistan. The same with many other refugees that she fled Pakistan because not only war and persecution, but also the Taliban took over the country in early 90s when she was compelled to leave Afghanistan to come to Pakistan. She was a teacher herself back in Afghanistan. So when she came to Pakistan and started to live in the refugee camp in Pakistan, she didn't see lots of opportunities for refugee children to study, especially for the girls, refugee girls, because as you may know that even in the Afghan society, there is also this cultural barrier that girls do not need to go to school, girls do not need to read and write, and girls just belong to houses. So she broke all that rules and cultural norms and started to teach refugees, especially the refugee girls. From tens to hundreds, then thousands of refugees in Pakistan have benefited from her teaching. And in 2015, she was awarded the Nansen Refugee Award. Not really sure if you also know about this award. This is the highest achievement that UNHCR is giving to whether individual or a group or organization that contributes to the protection of refugees. So she got this award in 2015, but the real award that she got was actually in 2017 by the Pakistani government, where her school that she started from the refugee camp has been then recognized by the Board of Education in Pakistan. That means that all refugee children studying in her school will be given exactly the same school diploma that other children in Pakistan are studying, whether in public schools or in private schools throughout Pakistan. I feel that this story is very inspiring. I was in Pakistan when this happened, so I witnessed the whole thing, the process, and then the ceremony to award Ibu Akila Asifi, so that is her name. And I hope that this story also could inspire many of you here. And also, Pakistan is similar to Indonesia. It's not a state party to the 1951 convention. It doesn't even have a national legal framework. Indonesia has, as Ibu Tehira already mentioned, the presidential regulation, but still Pakistan has been very generously protecting the refugees for the last 40 years now. And many access to basic rights are being given to the refugees. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to that story. I hope that that is good to actually start the presentation with the story. Okay, the next slide will be about the refresher. I'm sure that you already aware about the concept of international protection, UNHCR's mandate, and maybe those who have not really been too familiar, then hopefully this will be useful for the next two slides. So basically, as we all know that, state has the authority to give the effective protection to its own people or any individuals within its territory. But there will be situations where people will be compelled to leave to other location within their country, whether in Indonesia context, whether it is because of natural disasters, whether it is because of sectarian issues or conflict issues as well. But these people not necessarily will go across the border to seek refuge in other country, but they will still find safety in other places within the country. So these people then will be called internally displaced persons. Or in Indonesia, we simply call them pengungsi or pengungsi internal. We have many examples in Indonesia. I'm sure that you are all aware, mostly people fled their kampung or villages to other kampung because of natural disaster. But we also have conflict IDPs who fled their villages because of sectarian issues. Up until now, we still have the Shia IDPs in Sidoarjo who still cannot return to their villages in Madura Island because then, their physical liberty and and life will be at risk if they go back because of their religious identity. In addition to the Shia Muslim, we also have the Ahmadi Muslim IDPs in Mataram, who still cannot go back to their villages in East West Lombok up until now, and they are still living in an IDP shelter in Mataram because of the sectarian issues. But the similarity between these two IDPs that I mentioned, that they still find safety in the other locations within Indonesia or even within the province that they are originally from. But there will be situation where there is no safe haven even within the country of origin. So they must leave the country and, you know, seeking international protection in the other country. So when that happens, so then we call them asylum seekers, and their status will be determined whether they are refugee or not under the Article 1A of the 1951 Refugee Convention. There is one principle that also Tehira mentioned in the beginning that is very important. That is a non-refoulement, which means that it's actually a prohibition for country to return individuals to his or and non-refoulement principle is not exclusively under the refugee law regime. It is also under the human rights law regime in general. You may have read the Convention Against Torture that Indonesia is already a state party to. There is also a provision about non-refoulement, and many other regional treaties that also contain similar provision, basically that recognizes the right to seek asylum and prohibition for people sent back to their country of origin where they will face persecution. So I hope that this is clear enough, because it is very important to understand the distinction between IDPs as well as asylum seekers and refugees. The reasons why they fled could be similar, but then the law regime applies to them will be different. The next slide is that, again, you may are too familiar with this, so just consider this as a refresher. Who is refugee? There are different elements that need to be met, and this is also very much relevant to the slides in the next slides that I will talk a little bit more about refugee status determination, because this is what we are referring to when we are assessing asylum claim from someone, that he or she must be outside their country of origin, has well-founded fear of persecution, and this well-founded fear of persecution also has to be the nexus to one of the convention grounds, such as race, religion, nationality, membership of particular social group, and political opinion. And last but not least is they are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. And what it is very interesting as well and important to note is that, as Tehira mentioned about the presidential regulation, so the definition of refugee under the presidential regulation is exactly the same with the Article 1A of the 1951 Convention. And we are so grateful, because then it means that, you know, Indonesia basically is applying exactly the same standard when it comes to defining who is refugee and who deserves international protection in Indonesia. Now, before going a little bit deep to the national context, I think it's also very important to share as well about the global and regional context, what is happening outside Indonesia and what is happening in our region, Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia in particular. So this is the report that UNHCR published in mid-2020, just to give you an idea how many displaced people around the world, and amongst them, how many refugees. As you can see, as per mid-2020, there are more than 26 million refugees globally. More than 20 million of them are the ones, as Ibu Ira mentioned, under UNHCR's mandate, and almost 6 million of them are Palestinian refugees. There is another UN agency that is called UNRWA that has a specifically mandate to protect and give assistance to Palestinian refugees. They are operating mostly in the Middle Eastern countries. We don't have that in Asia or in Indonesia. So any Palestinian seeking asylum in Indonesia or in Asia, they will then be benefited as well from UNHCR's program. as well as from the 1951 convention. We'll talk a little bit more about this, and feel free if you also have questions about this. And from the 26 million refugees in Indonesia, in the world, 85% of them are being hosted by developing countries. So do not be fooled by the mainstream medias, especially the mainstream Western medias. The developing countries are actually more generous than developed countries when it comes to hosting the refugees. As you can see, 3.6 million of them are in Turkey, and 3 million of them only, they are Syrians, while 600,000 are coming from different countries. We have Colombia, we have Pakistan, we have Uganda, and Germany is the only developed country that is hosting more refugees compared to the other Western countries or EU countries. And in fact, if you can see the top 8 or the top 10 of the host nations, only Germany is the only developed country, while the others are the same like Indonesia, developing country. Even some are actually having probably less economic growth, economic strength compared to Indonesia, but still they are helping more refugees than Indonesia. On the screen, you can also see that only 67% of the global refugees are coming only from the 5 countries: the Syrian Arab Republic, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And we have all this in Indonesia, with an exception of South Sudan. I'll give you the breakdown of where the refugees are originally from, who are now in Indonesia. The next slide, I think, is also very important for you to understand the characteristic of refugees who are in Asia Pacific region. In Asia, we have both urban and refugee camp setting. In Indonesia, we only have the urban refugees. We don't have refugee camps here. Aceh is a bit exception. We don't really call it refugee camp. We call it like refugee shelter or temporary accommodation. But throughout Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, many refugees are actually living in urban areas. Some countries, they do have refugee camps as well. So it's quite unique when it comes to Asia Pacific, because we do have both settings when it comes to sheltering the refugees. And the refugees in Asia are coming from so many different countries. So it's not really homogeneous, but it's a lot. You will see in Indonesia how many we have in the next slide. And the other characteristic that we would like to share with you is that the protection needs blurred by mixed factors. So it is protection related, why people fled their countries, but also there are so many other factors why they fled their countries. There are statelessness factor, there are poverty, there are discrimination, and many other things that kind of like combine and could be amounted to persecution, which then, compel people to leave. So that's the characteristic that also we would like to share with you. Irregular and onward movement. I think when it comes to the Rohingya refugees, as you may know, the Rohingyas happen to be stateless as well, not only refugees. Just to clarify, not all refugees are stateless, but some refugees are stateless. And because of the statelessness, Rohingyas, they don't have any legal documentation that allows them to have passport. That leave them only to choose illegal pathway to travel outside Myanmar. So that's why the irregular movement is quite common, happen in Indonesia, in Asia Pacific, with the prominent example is the Rohingyas. And also the onward movement. Again, the Rohingya example is the best example, because many fled to Bangladesh, and almost 1 million of them are now being hosted in Cox's Bazar, which is border to Myanmar. But then many of them also decided to onward move to other countries, including to Malaysia, to Indonesia as well, and to Thailand. And their final destination, or their intended final destination, has always been Malaysia, because Malaysia has almost 200,000 refugees, and most of them are the Rohingyas. So there is that family reunification reason why the Rohingyas wanted to go to Malaysia, and also the fact that the refugees in Malaysia, they are allowed to work. So then they can engage in income generating activities for them to help themselves and their family. So that's the other characteristic. And the use of immigration detention by states, Malaysia, Thailand, and some other countries in Asia Pacific, they are still applying detention regime for refugees and asylum seekers. And I think as an Indonesian, we are all need to be very proud that the detention regime in Indonesia has ended in 2018. There was this directive issued by the Directorate General of Immigration in 2018 that basically restored the function of Immigration Detention Center. So the Immigration Detention Center is not function to detain asylum seekers or refugees, but only those who are violating immigration rules, or they call it immigratoire. That officially ended the detention regime. So refugees and asylum seekers are no longer in detention situation in Indonesia. Although detention happens from time to time, but not necessarily because of their status as asylum seeker and refugee. Also in Southeast Asia in particular, you will find kind of like a very well-established smuggling and trafficking network. And unfortunately, many of asylum seekers and refugees still need distance to, to go to other country to seek protection by asking help from smugglers and traffickers. It's just the reality that happens in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia in particular, and especially when it comes to the Rohingyas, all of them are able to travel outside of Myanmar only because of the assistance of the smugglers and traffickers. That means that within the journey, they are very vulnerable and has been exposed multiple times to violence, to sexual gender-based violence, and many other horrible things that happen while they were on the boat, unfortunately. And last but not least, despite all that challenges and issues, the other characteristic is that, of course, problems also then create opportunities and possible solutions. And the same like in other countries, in Indonesia, we too trying to explore different solutions for the refugees. Not only the three that we call it traditional durable solution, that is voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement, but also through other means that include family reunification, joint labor schemes with host communities, education, and many other things that I will try to elaborate in my next slide. Now, let's go to the national context or Indonesian context. How many refugees that we have in Indonesia? So this is the latest statistic that UNHCR published as per end of April. So we have 13,459 individuals, and they are scattered all over in different islands, different cities. But the most refugees and asylum seekers, they are resided in Greater Jakarta area, or we call it Jabodetabek. Around more than 7,000 of them living in Greater Jakarta area, while other thousands, they live in Makassar, in Medan, Pekanbaru. We have small number in Kupang, small number in Makassar, Surabaya, Semarang, Tanjung Pinang, and of course Aceh, that is exclusively Rohingya refugees. And the response is still ongoing. And I will talk a little bit more about what is happening in Lok Sumawe, Aceh. Now, despite the small number that Indonesia has when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, but there are more than 40 countries of origins that the refugees are originally from. So can you imagine in the context of refugee status determination, so we need to know what is going on in all these more than 40 countries about the human rights violation happened there, the current situation, security situation. This is becoming very interesting if you are interested to actually learn more about refugee status determination. And of course, out of that 40 plus countries, the majority, more than 56% of the refugees in Indonesia, they are coming from Afghanistan. And even within that Afghan refugees, the majority, they are minority group in Afghanistan, that they are Hazaras by ethnicity and Shia Muslim by religion. That because of that, their religious and ethnic identity, that they have been targeted by the majority groups and the militant groups such as the Taliban. So we have Somalia, Iraq, Myanmar. The majority is the Rohingya, but not only the Rohingyas who are seeking asylum in Indonesia who are coming from Myanmar, we also have other ethnic groups from Myanmar who are seeking asylum in Indonesia as well. We have Sudan, we have Sri Lanka, mostly Tamils, Yemen, Palestine, and others. So I'll share with you in detail about the statistic, maybe on the chat box later, just for your information, and just in case that you are writing your dissertation and need some updated statistic about how many refugees and where they are from in Indonesia. This is already mentioned also with Ira. So when it comes to refugee protection, the only national legal framework that we have at the moment that is specifically talking about the handling of the refugees in Indonesia is the Presidential Regulation 125/2016. But of course, as you also may be aware, that the right to seek asylum, however, is actually recognized by other national legal framework from the from the constitutional law, the Undang-Undang Dasar, the Human Rights Law 1999, that all also recognize right to seek asylum. So the right to seek asylum itself is not something that is new in the national legal framework, but the Presidential Regulation 125 is, of course, that put more focus on not only the right to seek asylum, but the definition of the refugee. But again, the right to seek asylum is not something new. So we always also refer to the Undang-Undang Dasar or the constitutional law as the national legal framework that also protects anyone seeking asylum in Indonesia. And in the presidential regulation, as you can see in some points that I mentioned, and I put this on the slide, is emphasizing on the cooperation between different actors, government, non-government, especially the international organizations such as UNHCR and also IOM. There's also a provision when it comes to search and rescue at sea. So this is very much relevant to what is happening in Aceh. That usually happens every 2 years. There's always boat disembarkation in Aceh. And usually the Basarnas, the Search and Rescue Agency, the Water Police, Polair, and Bakamla, they do some kind of like a search and rescue operation to see the boats in distress and help them. But also in the context of Aceh, we have to acknowledge also the very important role of Acehnese fishermen, that they have their own traditional law or hukum adat that legally binds all the fishermen in Aceh to help everyone that is in distress in Acehnese water. And the first disembarkation that happened last year in June 2020, they were actually assisted by the fishermen to disembark to Aceh. Also in the presidential regulation, there is a provision where when someone declares their intention to seek asylum, so the immigration personnel or anyone needs to actually refer that individuals to UNHCR, so then UNHCR can conduct the refugee status determination. And also what it is very important to note that under the presidential regulation, there is also this task given to the local government, whether at the regency level or at the city level, to provide shelter for the refugees or accommodation. This is what happened in Aceh, where the temporary accommodation that they called the LK is actually provided by the local government in Lok Semawe. Now, let's move on to what is UNHCR's mandate, or Teira mentioned a little bit in the beginning what UNHCR is doing in Indonesia, in a country where, that we maintain our non-membership to the 1951 Convention. So the first one, of course, that we are here to assist the governments in ensuring the international protection of refugees and asylum seekers. The second is that we also assist refugees to find durable solution. And as I mentioned earlier, there are three traditional or conventional durable solutions. The first one is voluntary repatriation, if it is safe enough for the refugees to go back to their country in dignity. The second one is local integration, where the refugees will be locally integrated in the country of asylum. In the context of Indonesia, it's still not possible. We don't have any national legal framework that allows this to happen. And of course, the government also would mention that they are not a state party to the 1951 convention, so they don't have that obligation to integrate or locally integrate refugees in Indonesia. And the third one is resettlement. Basically, for the refugees to be placed in the third country, mostly developed countries, those already signed the 1951 convention. But unfortunately, when it comes to resettlement, the number or the quota has been reduced significantly over the years. And UNHCR statistic is that even before the pandemic, less than 1% global refugees benefited from resettlement every year, meaning more than 99% global refugees will not be benefited from resettlement. So this is the reason why UNHCR, as a refugee agency, we try to be more innovative and trying to explore other possibilities that could benefit the refugees, whether in the country of asylum or alternative pathways to the third country. I will talk a little bit more also about this. The other mandate and activity that we are doing in Indonesia, of course, to disseminate international refugee law. And this is exactly what I'm doing right now. So thank you again. And when it comes to IDPs, it's not automatically we are going to assist the IDPs, because, you know, when it comes to IDPs, of course, then they will be still under the responsibility of the government, their own government. And UNHCR's involvement in the IDPs is very minimal. Only in exceptional situation when the state appeals for international assistance, then UNHCR can help. In Indonesia, UNHCR's involvement in IDPs, it happened during the tsunami in Aceh, very long time ago. And then the last one was during the tsunami and earthquake in Palu in 2018. So in between and after that, we're not really involved in any IDPs operation in Indonesia. And the last one, maybe you are not really familiar, in addition to our refugee protection mandate, UNHCR also has a mandate when it comes to statelessness. Sometimes the issues are overlapping, but I will talk a little bit more about UNHCR statelessness mandate and how we do these statelessness related activities in Indonesia in my next slide. This is the comprehensive solutions, as I mentioned before, that the durable solutions that we have been having is not that relevant anymore. It's still relevant, but we still need to also explore other possibilities. So instead of calling durable solutions, UNHCR is now calling it as comprehensive solutions, because it's more comprehensive, not only the three conventional solutions that I mentioned, but also other things that could actually happen in the country of asylum and also alternative pathway to the third country. So access to education is one of them. I think we all agree when it comes to right to education is a human right. And Indonesia has human rights obligation when it comes to respect, protect, and fulfill right to education for all individuals living in Indonesia, including, of course, the refugees and asylum seekers. I think if you are studying international Bill of Rights, that include, of course, the ICCPR, that Indonesia is a state party to, the ratification is there, and the same with the other international human rights treaties. The nature or the spirit of the Human Rights Convention is a non-discrimination principle. And usually it's always under the Article 2, where basically the convention, all the provisions in the convention apply to all individuals, regardless where they're from, their nationality, their race, their religion, and so on and so forth. So this is also the argument that we are giving to the government of Indonesia, that they do have human rights obligation when it comes to right to education for the refugees. And this is also the reason why then in 2019, in July, the Ministry of Education and Culture issued the circular letters that allows refugees to study in public schools in Indonesia until the secondary school level. There is still no legal framework that allows refugees to go to university, and this is one of the main focus as well that UNHCR and our partners are doing when it comes to advocacy. And especially Teh Orin mentioned, well, during the informal discussion that we have had before the webinar, is that under the Convention of the Rights of the Child that Indonesia is already a state party to, if you have seen the Article 22, it's actually about refugee children. And Indonesia did not make any reservation on that article. That means, you know, the CRC in Indonesia also should be the effective protection tool for all children in Indonesia, including refugees and asylum seekers. Refugee empowerment, so it is basically access to livelihood. I will talk a little bit more as well later, because Indonesia has made a pledge during the Global Refugee Forum that we will be allowing refugees to be given new skills, and that skills will then be utilized by private sector in Indonesia. We are still waiting from the Ministry of Manpower that we hope that they are going to issue like a circular letter that allows refugee to, you know, to involve in refugee empowerment or livelihood activities in Indonesia. But since the pandemic is not a priority, unfortunately, but we are continuing our advocacy to the Ministry of Manpower in regard to the refugee empowerment. The private sponsorship and scholarship, I think this is the new developments for the refugees in Indonesia. Is basically alternative pathway to the third country. Different countries, they have private sponsorship program for refugees. It's not a resettlement scheme, it's purely immigration scheme. Like in countries like Canada, for instance, 5 Canadian citizens can sponsor 1 refugee to go to Canada. They have to initiate the process in Canada, and usually the process is quicker, and also it's not free, it's quite expensive, but many refugees in Indonesia also have benefited from this scheme as well. And we hope that even in the next years to come, there will be more refugees who will be benefited from this. And scholarship from overseas universities. So there are many universities in different countries. They are providing scholarship for refugees around the world, including in Indonesia, for them to go to that country and then study and stay after their completing their studies in that university. In Indonesia, we have a major breakthrough this year. So 1 Afghan refugee granted scholarship in Lithuania, is a country in Europe, and we just got the news actually just last week that she landed in Lithuania to pursue her higher education. And we hope that there will be more university in other countries also providing the same opportunities. So then the refugees can go to those countries and to study. And again, because in Indonesia, the refugees are still not allowed to go to university or study in university formally. Although there are some refugees who are informally studying in different universities in Indonesia. We have, like in Jakarta, with in Atmajaya, in Tanri Abeng University, Sampurna University, Pelita Harapan University, and outside Java, we have in Unhas, Makassar, in Riau, Universitas Islam Riau, also provide a similar opportunity for the refugees to sit in and benefited from different lecturers in their higher education institution. And we hope UNPAD maybe can consider as well in the future to do the same. Now, let's talk more about refugee status determination. Teh Ira shared some questions with me before this webinar, basically telling that there are some questions from the students related to RSD. So I thought that just to put 2-3 slides about RSD, how we do RSD, and maybe then, I don't know, could inspire you also to write something on your thesis or dissertation about RSD. So when it comes to RSD or refugee status determination, so how we do RSD is we do individual determination and also we do group determination. In Indonesian context and in most countries' context, we do individual determination, meaning that each individual will be interviewed and then will be assessed as well individually about their fear of persecution and then the nexus of that persecution to the one of the convention grounds. And then, then we conclude whether this person will have to be granted refugee status or not. It can be done by state or by UNHCR. Of course, for the countries who have ratified the 1951 convention, usually they have their own national asylum system and they conduct RSD themselves. But in countries like Indonesia, we haven't ratified the convention. So UNHCR is doing RSD on behalf of the government. But there are other countries that are doing that we call hybrid system. So both UNHCR and the government are doing RSD. And what we have, the record that we have right now, at least 20 countries are practicing this hybrid system. So we have countries like Sudan, where the government and UNHCR are doing RSD. We have countries like Azerbaijan, where the first instance is done by UNHCR, while the appeal stage is done by the government. So there are so many different innovation, I guess, when it comes to RSD, and still this allows to happen as long as it follows the same international standard and principles. And we do not know whether Indonesia will go to which direction, but we hope eventually Indonesia will take the lead as well to do the RSD. Malaysia is considering now, just for your information, to take the lead in refugee status determination, and is now under close coordination and collaboration with UNHCR, how to make that transition from UNHCR's RSD to the government RSD. Okay, the second determination that UNHCR is doing is by group determination. Usually when or during the situation when there is influx of refugees, hundreds of thousands or even millions of refugees going to one country seeking asylum. So there is no way that UNHCR or country can do individual determination. So that's why we also have the group determination, meaning that they just need to kind of like prove that they actually belong to that particular country or particular minority groups and all that, and then they will then be granted refugee status. Maybe just to give you an example, during the US-led invasion to Iraq, millions of Iraqis, they went to Syria, they went to Jordan, and other neighboring countries, including also Turkey. And there's no way anyone can do individual determination. So what UNHCR was doing at that time, that we conducted the group determination, and then we granted them prima facie refugee status. And this has also happened now in Turkey because of 3 million of Syrian refugees are in Turkey. There's no way we can do the individual determination. So the prima facie or group determination was also then chose to be the perfect method to conduct the refugee status determination. Now, this is the flow chart, if you may, how we do RSD. So in UNHCR perspective, RSD is, we call it quasi-legal or half-legal, although we do apply the same legal principles that the courts are using, but of course, when it comes to the threshold, should be lower, because at the end, UNHCR is not a court, it's not a tribunal, but just to also making sure the decision, the assessment that we are making is higher quality and following the international standards. So then we follow the same principles as the tribunal is doing, or as the court is doing when it comes to assessing asylum claim. So it always starts with registration. Anyone who comes to UNHCR want to seek asylum, we register them. And we get their basic biodata. And also now in UNHCR, we are doing the biometric verification, meaning that if Teh Orin wants to seek asylum in Malaysia, in UNHCR Malaysia, Teh Orin will be then verified by biometric through the fingerprints as well as the iris scan, just to make sure that Teh Orin has not applied asylum in other countries. And even if she did, then it will be easier to verify, okay, Teh Orin has applied asylum in the Philippines. So then we want to know what she was claiming in the Philippines. So because we also need to verify the consistency of the asylum claim, because we want to prevent what we call it asylum shopping. And unfortunately, some people do that. They are rejected in one country and they're going to another country and having exactly similar or completely different story. So we want to avoid that. So that's why the biometric verification is becoming very important in our registration exercise in the beginning of the case processing in UNHCR. During the registration, we will then also identify the vulnerability that the asylum seekers have, whether they are children, they are women, maybe victims of sexual gender-based violence. They are children, maybe they are unaccompanied minors. Or they are people with mental disability. So all this needs to be taken into consideration when we then schedule interview with them, because interviewing the adult is completely different than than interviewing the child, and interviewing the healthy adult is different with interviewing the adults who have maybe mental disorder. This will be taken into consideration, how we conduct the interview and how we do the assessment as well, because you cannot expect children or you cannot expect people with mental health disability to provide you exactly the same details about your story than the healthy adults. So everything is actually regulated in our RSD handbook. It's available online in the refworld.org if you want to see. And I think it's good also to share this with you, so then you know or have an idea how we do the RSD. So after the registration, then we will conduct the first interview. Before we conduct the interview, usually the caseworker or the legal officer, they would then have to prepare the country of origin information. For instance, if you interview someone from South Sudan, you may want to know what is happening in South Sudan. The human rights situation there, the security situation there, especially when it comes to minority groups, maybe religious minorities, maybe ethnic minorities, and how they are treated in their country of origin. So you want to be very prepared before the interview. So when the interview happens, you can ask relevant questions and you can do probing as well, because the idea of the interview is a facts finding. So what the refugee is claiming, we need to actually establish whether it is credible or not. And this is part of the assessment. The next one that you can see on the assessment, we need to establish whether what they are claiming is credible. And even when there are some doubts, we also need to see the bigger picture, taking into consideration the vulnerability that was identified at the early stage. Meaning, if someone cannot provide you detailed narration of why they left their country, usually in normal situation that you may think that what he or she is claiming is not credible. But then we need to take the consideration, okay, the person is uneducated. The person has mental disability. The person is a minor. So the threshold will be even lower. And then there is a principle under the legal regime as well as in RSD is the benefit of the doubt. We do apply benefit of the doubt, taking into consideration the vulnerability that I mentioned, and we still somehow accept what they claim as credible, taking into consideration what I just mentioned. So, but again, it's case by case basis. So that's why when it comes to individual RSD, it's always very individualized approach that we use in assessing asylum claim. And in the assessment, after we establish that what they are claiming is credible, then we would then trying to find the nexus with the convention trial, whether it is race, whether it is nationality, religion, membership of particular social group, or political opinion. Maybe just a little bit more elaboration on the membership of particular social group. Because I think the other grounds are pretty much clear, I think, for everyone. But for the membership of particular social group, we usually use this ground to gender-based violence or gender-based persecution. In some countries, being a woman is actually a ground for persecution. It happens, unfortunately. There is also, when it comes to sexual orientation minority, the LGBTI community, that we also use this ground to grant them refugee status. And there are many other situations or circumstances that could fall under this membership of particular social group. Then in the assessment, we will then make a recommendation. Yes, Theorin is a refugee under ethnicity ground. Maybe if a Sundanese ethnicity will then be persecuted in Indonesia, then Theorin can seek asylum and granted refugee status in other country. Joking aside, but that's how we do the assessment. Then after the legal officer or the caseworker do the assessment, they need to submit the assessment to the reviewer. And the reviewer will be another officer who reviews from A to Z, from the procedural of RST, whether it was followed strictly or not, and whether the claims that presented by the asylum seekers are corroborated by evidentiary support or not, and whether there is consistency between the registration, the first interview, and so on and so forth. Because consistency is very important in the, that we call it the credibility indicator. Because, you know, if you say that at the registration you leave your country because you belong to religious minority, and then suddenly during the interview that you say that is actually because of the ethnic minority or something else, that will raise credibility issue. So that's why the reviewer will check the consistency as well of the story. And then the decision will then produce whether recognition or rejection. But also at times that the reviewer will then send the cases back to the legal officer or the caseworker for them to conduct additional interview or to conduct additional research. Yeah. So in the situation of rejection, the asylum seekers will still have the right to appeal, and usually they need to submit their appeal application within 30 days after they were notified the first instance decision. And the decision at the appeal stage is final. So when he or she is also rejected at the appeal stage, the case will be closed, and he or she will no longer be a person of concern to UNHCR, meaning that the immigration law could be applied to him. That include you know, being returned to the country of origin. Now, because we have Christy here, and Christy may also be very interested in these exclusion triggers, we call it. So to determine whether someone is a refugee or not, then they have to be first fulfill the inclusion criteria, what I mentioned before, but they also need to not fulfilling what we call it the exclusion criteria. Under the 1951 Convention, there are different exclusions. Article 1E and 1D is pretty much straightforward. The Article 1E, there are some asylum seekers who have second nationality or second citizenship. So if they actually fled from one country of origin and they still have effective protection from other country of citizenship, so they will then be excluded because they don't need international protection. That's Article 1E. But for the Article 1D is mostly applies to the Palestinian refugees. So in countries where the UNRWA is operating, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, the Palestinian refugees will not be protected under UNHCR's or 1951 Convention, but then they will be assisted and protected by UNRWA. That's the Article 1D. But then when the Palestinians seeking asylum in Indonesia, for instance, we have no UNRWA, so we do make the Article 1D assessment to assess whether they could also fall into the refugee definition under the 1951 Convention. If not, then they will be excluded and need to or will then get the protection from the UNRWA, as I mentioned before. Now, the Article 1F, why I mentioned Teh Christy, because the Article 1F is about people who are not deserving international protection because they have committed international crimes, like the war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and also the non-political serious crimes like murders, like armed robberies and all that. It's a very lengthy procedure because even the country office, we cannot make a conclusion, yes, Teh Orien has committed war crime. It's a big thing, yeah, to actually make that conclusion. So what we do is that we do the thorough exclusion interview, thorough exclusion assessment, but then the endorsement will be made in our headquarters in Geneva. And again, you may know probably who have done the international criminal law, how to prove someone is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity. It's difficult, you know. And again, especially in our perspective as a UNHCR, that we are a humanitarian worker, we're not a tribunal, but still we need to make that kind of facts finding and then conclusion, whether there is a likelihood or reasonable to believe that someone has committed the crimes that I mentioned. Now, just talking a little bit about the COVID-19 response, I think this is something that we have to talk about it, and the fact that refugees are marginalized groups in Indonesia, so then they can be easily forgotten when it comes to COVID-19 response and treatment. And as we know that basically under these circumstances, we cannot leave anyone behind. If someone is not being treated properly or have equal access to COVID-19 treatment and all that, it will definitely give negative effect to the whole population. So in Indonesian context, during the pandemic, in the beginning of the pandemic, UNHCR was actively advocating with our partners in different platforms when it comes to COVID-19 testing, access to the COVID-19 shelter, isolation facility, and we have been very grateful that Indonesia has been very inclusive when it comes to COVID-19 response. Even since the beginning of the pandemic, we have had refugees, even when PCR test was so expensive, as you all know. Refugees in Kalideres, for instance, they were given PCR tests by the Puskesmas in Kalideres, and also in other locations as well. And those who were tested positive in big cities like Jakarta, Medan, Makassar, they can also have access to, in Jakarta, we have this Wisma Atlet, in Kemayoran, and also similar accommodations in Makassar, Medan. They also have access to that facilities free of charge. So we are very grateful that this happened, and also this is because of the continuous advocacy that UNHCR and our partners are doing, directly, bilaterally, and also under that we call it National Cluster Coordination System. So the government activated that National Cluster Coordination in the beginning of the pandemic, as usually they do that during the natural disaster. But COVID-19, although it's not a natural disaster, but it has probably even greater effect than the natural disaster. So that's why the government decided to activate the National Cluster Coordination that gathers government, non-government, UN agencies, humanitarian organizations, and advocacy-based organizations to work together regarding this issue. And now we are continuing our advocacy when it comes to access to COVID-19 vaccines. We have received positive response from the Ministry of Health that the refugees, asylum seekers will be included in the next COVID-19 national vaccination program. But of course, Indonesian nationals will then be prioritized first. And also, just while I'm actually speaking now, Pekanbaru has even taken the lead. Next week, refugees in Pekanbaru also will start to give the COVID-19 vaccines, which we are happy. I don't know with you, I myself have not even been vaccinated. So I'm happy that this happened in Pekanbaru, and hopefully other cities will also then follow. Advocating for livelihood, this is something that also we are focusing on. because the refugees, we need to acknowledge them that they do have skills, talents, that if they are allowed to use their talents and skills, they could actually contribute to the country of asylum, to Indonesia, to benefit Indonesia and to benefit local community. So this is what we are advocating for. The refugees need to be acknowledged that they are human beings like us, have their own aspirations, skills, talents, and they want to contribute. So this is also related to what I mentioned before. We are still waiting for the Ministry of Manpower to issue that circular letter. So then that will be the legal basis for the private sectors then to utilize skills that the refugees have. But of course, there are some compromises that are made by UNHCR and our partners with the government. For instance, that if this happens, when it comes to the financial compensation or the minimum wage, it needs to be lower than the national or the city minimum wage, just to prevent social issue jealousy from the local people. So yeah, that happens, and probably that will happen. And to prepare the refugees when that legal framework happens or enacted, we UNHCR and partners, we are conducting different vocational trainings, from the language trainings, as you can see on your screen, tailoring, cooking, many other things, and some refugees even have IT skills that incredibly very useful, especially nowadays. So we want them to be empowered. So when that circular letter issued, so then there will be refugees who are ready to work in company A, company B, or wherever. It is very important because it's not UNHCR is pushing this, but the government of Indonesia also has a made commitment on this, and I will just show you in the next slide. So during the Global Refugee Forum in 2019, so Indonesian delegation led by Ibu Mutia Hafid from Komisi 1 DPR basically pledged in front of the international forum in Geneva that Indonesian government will, allowing refugees to be empowered or developing refugee empowerment program, meaning that it's actually income generating activities. So because of that commitment and pledge, so we are continuously advocating and reminding and following up with the governments, different government agencies for this to happen. And again, this happened in 2019 and 2020 when we were following up, and then the pandemic happened. So then it was not really prioritized. But now, since COVID-19 has become a bit mainstream, so we are continuously or resume again our advocacy to the Ministry of Manpower. Even we approach the OJK, the Financial Service Authority, because we also want, when the refugees are allowed to have access to livelihood, it is also very important for them to have access to banking service. It's not something that is unique. It happened in other countries. Pakistan is one of the examples. Despite that Pakistan is not a state party to the 1951 convention, but the refugees, the same like you and me, we can open the bank account in any national banks in Pakistan. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll talk a little bit about the ongoing Rohingya refugee response in Aceh. As you may all be aware, the 2 disembarkations happened last year in June and then in September. So there were around almost 400 Rohingya refugees. The number has been reduced significantly. Many, they have moved onward to Malaysia, and many have been transferred to IOM accommodation in Medan. But what I wanted to share with you is that during the first and second disembarkation in Aceh, there are more than 30 humanitarian organizations with UNHCR helping the refugees and the local authorities. The support was very overwhelming, and we are so grateful this happened because, it also shows, the generosity of, I think the Indonesian people and Acehese people in particular in helping the refugees. Although the involvement of the local NGOs now reduced because the number of the refugees also reduced, but we maintain that coordination because the both disembarkation in Aceh, will not stop now. It will happen again, whether this year, whether it'll happen again next year, we do not know, and we want to be ready. And also this is the reason also UNHCR is intensifying our advocacy at the provincial level. So we are wanting to draft a kanun. You know, in Aceh they have this kanun, like a bylaw or peraturan daerah that will be refugee friendly, and we got support from the provincial authorities, and we want this to move forward. But of course, in legal drafting and all that, UNHCR cannot do that alone. So we are collaborating with LBH, the legal aid, as well as the Contras. And we hope by end of this year, we'll have the draft of the kanun regarding the handling of refugees in Aceh. I mentioned before about more than 30 organizations with UNHCR helping the refugees in Aceh. So what we were doing, that we divided into different sectors or clusters or working groups. Logistic cluster or sector, health sector, food and nutrition, education, psychosocial, women protection, water, sanitation, and hygiene. This is kind of like a typical response in humanitarian response that happens not only in the context of refugees, but IDPs and many other humanitarian operations. And Theorin probably knows better because she worked with the French Red Cross before, because we work closely with Red Cross movement as well as the Red Crescent movement in helping the refugees in Aceh. This is the latest pictures. I was in Aceh just a couple of months ago. This is the shelters that UNHCR and partners have built. You can also see the classrooms that we also built where the educational activities happen there. Now, the last two slides, I guess, I just wanted to talk a little bit about UNHCR statelessness mandate, or in Indonesia, we call it orang tanpa kewarganegaraan. You can see the definition yourself under the Article 1 of the 1954 Convention, which also Indonesia is not a state party. And again, the issues of refugee protection and statelessness could overlap. Some refugees are stateless, like the Rohingyas, for instance. Even, I don't know if you know, there are some ethnic groups that live within the Iraq-Iran borders, like the Faili Kurds, that they are also stateless. They are not really Iranians, they are also not really Iraqis. And we do have them also in Indonesia. But when it comes to how we do our statelessness mandate in Indonesia, it's very limited. Our involvement has been mostly on the advocacy on access to universal birth registration and birth certificates for all children in Indonesia, including refugee children or children born from mixed marriage, Indonesian and refugees. Our partners has been Dukcapil, of course. That's where we get our KTP, Kartu Keluarga, and all that. Bappenas, because Bappenas has a civil registration and vital statistic program that includes asylum seekers and refugees. For the non-government, we work closely with Jesuit Refugee Services and also LBH APIC in Kupang. You can ask more about what we do exactly when it comes to this. And it's very exciting year because this year we also received additional funding from the US. So we were given a chance to select a partner. And just last week, UNDIP has been selected as our implementing partner to conduct a baseline study because we want to understand the statelessness situation in Indonesia, not only the refugees who are stateless, but also Indonesians who live in border areas, to Malaysia, to the Philippines, to Papua New Guinea, and also the undocumented domestic workers returning from Malaysia or other countries to Indonesia. And we do not know their number, nor the government of Indonesia. So we hope with this baseline study that will be conducted by UNDIP, we will know better by end of this year. There are precise number, so-and-so stateless people or statelessness-alike people live in Indonesia. And we hope, we started this month, and we hope by December we can conclude this, exercise. Okay, I opened the presentation with a story. I will close my presentation with another story. This is a former Iraqi refugee. It's very somehow connected to Indonesia because he left Iraq and traveled to Australia via Malaysia, Indonesia, and then landed in the Christmas Island, which is like 3 hours away from Java Island and part of the Australian territory. He was detained for 10 months while his asylum claim was processed, and then granted refugee status, released, and then because he was a doctor himself back in Iraq, so he tried to practice medicines as well in Australia. It was not an easy job, but he managed. And during the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, he was and still one of the frontliners helping all Australians dealing with the pandemic. And he's also a human rights activist. He's a humanitarian worker. He has traveled to his country of origin, Iraq, also to help the medical workers there, the health workers there. And just last year, the Australian government awarded him as the Australian of the Year of New South Wales. So I think the story is very inspiring because, if refugees in Indonesia are given the access to their basic rights in Indonesia, we will have many people like him, and also Akila Asifi, the teacher that I showed you in the beginning. Because again, refugees are like us, they have the talent, skills, and if they are allowed, they will and can contribute to the country of asylum, like in Indonesia. Okay, I will stop myself there. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Kang Isa. It's really comprehensive and inspiring presentation. I always want to be a humanitarian worker, but I end up here in the university teaching. So there's a lot of discussion because you mentioned a lot of issues. So I'm going to just in brief from the beginning. You also mentioned about the progress that that happened in Indonesia with the regulation in 2018 that initially someone who come to Indonesia without personal documentation, they will consider as illegal immigrant. But now the government already erased that regulation, and also good to see that there's besides the durable solution that we already known, like voluntary repatriation and then local integration, resettlement. There's also another comprehensive solution, and also with the initiative to empower refugee. And the most interesting, actually, if we discuss in class, is about the refugee status determination. Since we already know that there's a confidentiality of the process, so it's good to know how exactly in practice when you're handling the refugee status determination, also respond on the asylum seeker, how the process, and as already you mentioned that there's a individual and also a group determination. It's quite interesting because we know that in Europe it's common if they are responding to mass influx, there's a group determination. Well, we know that usually the determination is individual process, case by case. And also good to hear how the work of UNHCR Jakarta in response to COVID-19, and also good to know that Indonesian government give a good response, and together with UNHCR to give more protection to refugee in Indonesia. Before we open for discussion and read some of the questions from students, I will give the privilege to our colleague, to Ibu Christy, perhaps, and then we'll continue with a question from students. Monggo, Ibu Christy.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Ibu Ira and Isa. How are you? I'm so happy to see you again, safe and sound. I don't know which end of the world you are now. Are you still in Jakarta, or you are where? Because you keep like rapidly moving across the world. So you are in Jakarta. You're based in Jakarta now, Isa, ya?
Kemayoran to be exact, yes.
Kemayoran, okay. So thank you so much for the presentation, Isa. And Isa or Kang Isa ya? Oh, oke, Isa aja lah ya. So it more personal lah ya. Oke, Isa, actually I have a questions for you with regard to the RSD. Since you also mentioned my name during your earlier presentations. So well, I'm just wondering about the exclusions of the status that you said one of the exclusion is the serious war crimes, blah blah blah, and well, my concern is about the serious serious non-political crimes. Actually, I'm just wondering because the Terrorist Act. So the very controversial definition about the terrorism is that the crime is politically motivated. Probably I can give you one examples about the Uyghur. Is it Uyghur? How should I pronounce? Yeah, because when
Uyghur.
I well, I'm just make sure that I pronounce it correctly. Uyghur, yeah. If I'm not mistaken, there are some Uyghur people, I don't know, here in Indonesia or probably in other countries, fled because of the China government treat them not discriminatively, blah blah. I'm not going into detail about that part, but my question is that the Uyghur itself has been suspected as committed terrorist act, and then and also in Indonesia, the if we revert to the terrorism act, terrorist is considered also as the crimes that cannot be deemed or perceived as a political crime. So once you are condemned as the terrorism, means that you cannot ask for the, I don't know, political asylum or probably the refugee. So in Uyghur case, as we know that they have been treated discriminatively, blah blah blah, persecutions under the government of the China. But then if we see under the China law, what has been committed by them can be classified as the violations of their penal code. So yeah, I'm just wondering, have you been met that kind of a problem, and then you are in the middle, like in one hand they are considered as a terrorism and violated the home country's penal code, but in other hand, you know that they has been persecuted, blah blah blah. So yeah, because if I'm not mistaken, to be excluded as the refugee status, it doesn't have to be like finally decided by the court that they has been they have been committed the crimes, but suspected that the crime is also satisfied for this kind of exclusion. So that's just my questions. And I have another questions about the non-refoulement that is also in the refugee conventions. I'm just wondering whether this kind of violations of the non-refoulement, the refugee has to be granted the status refugee first, and then they can go to the article 30 something in the refugee to be protected for the non-refoulement, or I mean under the refugee status, of course, under the refugee status. So it has to be determined as a refugee status first, and then we can go to the non-refoulement provisions, or no, because we have also the same problems. Well, actually, when we have to coach the JSUP team, and this kind of question also raised during the during the drafting of the memorials. So that's also my questions. But of course, with regard to the Uyghur, we cannot. And if Indonesia have the kind of problem, we cannot refer to the refugee convention since we are not the party to the refugee. So say, for examples, that the Uyghur people fled to the Malaysia, for examples, as the, well, I don't know, Malaysia is parties or no. Anyway, that's my question, Isa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ibu Christy. because if we have a limited time, please, when not going to ask questions, please make it brief. Kang Isa mau langsung menjawab atau biar nggak lupa mungkin?
Karena pertanyaan udah susah dulu. Maybe I'll try to answer maybe the second question first when it comes to non-refoulement. So in UNHCR perspective, it doesn't have to be refugee or those who have been granted refugee status. Those who are still asylum seekers also, when there is that prevention of these people to save asylum, like closing the borders or pushing the boats, that is considered non-refoulement principle has been violated. So maybe that's the second question. I'm sure that you would probably want more elaboration, but I will try to as brief as possible, and we can have a coffee later if you want to have a more elaborated answer. On the second one, it's very important question. I personally have dealt with a group that was labeled as a terrorist group when I was in Iraq. I don't know if you have ever heard Mujahideen Ehal. So it's an Iranian exile group that was given protection by Saddam Hussein and labeled as terrorists by the Iranian regime and as well as the US and EU countries. Although later on then they lifted the label, so they are no longer terrorist group. But when I was there, they were still labeled as terrorist group. So when we were doing the RSD, so yes, definitely we consider the national legal framework where this group is coming from, which is Iran. But at the same time, we also make an assessment whether Iranian penal code, is actually upholding the international standard, human rights sensitive or not. So there is this RST that we call it prosecution against persecution. Maybe it is illegal and violating Iranian penal code, which means prosecution can be initiated. But then if we look a bit more deeper, actually it is persecution. It is politically motivated. And in Iran, it's not only about this group. Sometimes that we also have cases that they converted to other religion, and it's a death penalty in Iran if you converted to outside Islam. And when they are seeking asylum, we make that assessment, which conclude that the Iranian penal code is not as per the international standard, international human rights law, sensitive and all that. But to go back to your question, is very difficult to answer, and I don't think there is a yes or no answer. But when it comes to Uyghur, even UNHCR has been very careful because it's highest sensitive political issue, especially with China. And even to process asylum application from Uyghur applicants, we usually need to get a green light from headquarters in Geneva. That's how sensitive it is, and I'm not sure if I can share this with you, but I did it anyway. And in some countries, when I was in Turkey, there were lots of Uyghur refugees, and UNHCR has minimal involvement in that when it comes to RSD, because the Turkish government, they are taking the lead in protecting them, because for them the Uyghur is somehow part of the Turkish people. They speak similar language, same culture, same religion. So somehow we are grateful that we don't need even to involve. But I think even when we get the green light and needs to process their RSD or asylum claim, we'll definitely are using exactly the same standard from RSD handbook, RSD guidelines, and the international human rights law that are relevant against what they are being accused of, maybe in China. And I think when it comes, I never dealt with Uyghur applicant by myself, but I would believe that what happened with the Iranian penal code that I mentioned, even though the Uyghur then considered as terrorists, let's say, as per the Chinese penal code, probably is not going to fulfill the international standard that I mentioned, meaning that probably they will not being excluded from international refugee protection. But again, it's case by case, because not all Uyghurs involved in anything. They just normally, but some Uyghurs, they do participate and actively involved in some kind of movement. So that needs to be very carefully assessed, I guess. And when it comes to Article 1FB that Christy mentioned, the serious non-political crimes, usually we use this Article 1FB mostly for murders, for armed robberies. Rarely we are using this for terrorism-related offense, unfortunately. Sorry, Teh Kirsi, I don't think I answered your question. Also because I don't want to actually give you something that I'm not really sure. But I'm really happy to actually engage in more discussion with you about this. Maybe then you can enlighten us as well.
Thank you so much, Isa. Thank you.
Thank you, Kang Isa. Thank you for sharing this field experience, because when we talk about international refugee law, usually we only rely on the textbook, but you give some life experience, so it will definitely enlighten us. And sorry, I miss Ibu Upi when I greeting our colleague. Welcome, Bu Upi. Thank you for joining us today. And we have several questions, and to make it short, allow me to just start in reading the chat box. But the first question will be raised by Benita. You can ask directly, and then I will read the second question from Gregory from YouTube streaming, and then the third question I will read the question from Areta, and then go to Melania. Benita, feel free to ask.
Okay, thank you, Wira, for the opportunity. Hello, Mr. Isa. I like to ask you some question. The first one is, I wonder, Indonesia is not a party to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugee or its 1907 protocol. And we don't have a national refugee status determination system. And then does Indonesia as a country have the obligation to give protection, shelter, etc.? Or that will be the obligation of UNHCR? And then about the RST, in your experience, have you ever determined a refugee status and reject them as a refugee? Then what happened to them? And then I just read a news that a Rohingya Muslim refugee from Myanmar is not allowed by Bangladesh government to speak with UNHCR delegates. And they said that they cannot say anything critical against Bangladesh, and they don't have the access to work, also of proper health care. And then what I'm going to ask is, does refugee has a rights to be contacted by UNHCR or have the access of help from UNHCR? And then in IHL, they have ICRC have the right to access prisoner offer. And does this apply the same as UNHCR? Because I haven't read the convention yet, and I haven't studied about this deeply. And then the last question, I also wondering about the funding. I can imagine how much money are spent for them. And I just wonder, who is responsible for the funding? Is that the country of their nationality, or the country that accept them as refugee, or UNHCR, or who else? That is the question. Thank you, Mr. Isa.
So many questions, Kang Isa.
I'm sorry, Mira.
Okay, Kang Isa, monggo.
Okay, thank you so much, Benita, for the questions. In brief, when it comes to obligation, in our perspective, and it's an international perspective, state has the obligation when it comes to protecting the refugees, to respect and fulfill their basic rights. And again, what everyone also needs to remember, that UNHCR is a humanitarian organization. We don't have the infrastructure like the states have. We don't have hospitals, we don't have schools, we don't have legal framework that effectively can be enforced. The state have all that, and regardless whether they have ratified the 1951 convention or not, there are other international human rights treaties that they are legally bound to that are upholding the non-discrimination principle. I mentioned the ICCPR, ICACR, CRC. All of them have the non-discrimination principle. It applies to all individuals in the country's territory. And Indonesia has to actually enforce that also to non-nationals, that include refugees and asylum seekers. Of course, then UNHCR will work closely with the government, with the non-government as well, how the refugees can be better protected. within Indonesia's archipelago. But yeah, back to your question, the state has the responsibility. And if countries like Pakistan that I mentioned before, also is non-state party, even has 1.4 million refugees compared to Indonesia that is only slightly almost 14,000 refugees, and they can provide even better protection to the refugees. I think there is no reason that Indonesia cannot do the same. So that's the first question. And then the second one, I'm not sure if I got that accurately because I think your voice were breaking up as well. When it comes to RSD, you mentioned about Myanmarese refugees or Rohingya refugees, access to work, access to healthcare. So I'm not sure which context, but I think in Indonesian context, the Rohingya refugees or any other refugees, they have access to all UNHCR's program and assistance program, whether delivered directly by UNHCR or our partners. Healthcare, the refugees in Indonesia have access to primary healthcare or puskesmas. They are being treated equally like the Indonesians. They need to pay a small amount of administrative fee, but the other treatment can. And then if they need to be referred to the bigger hospitals, they can do the same, but they need to actually pay for that by themselves. And if they need financial assistance from UNHCR or partners, they can request. Because also we have limited resources, we assess case by case. In many cases, we can help when they need like surgery in bigger hospital or other serious medical treatments that need to be done or addressed like now. When it comes to access to work, there is no legal framework in Indonesia yet that allows refugees to involve in income generating activities. And this is why we are continuing our advocacy up to this date for the refugees to be allowed to work. It's not something unique. In Malaysia, they do that. In Thailand, they do that. In Pakistan, they do that. And while Indonesia has smaller number of refugees, I think Indonesia can do the same as well, because refugees, they do not want to be assisted all the time for an indefinite time. As I mentioned before, they do have skills and talents. And if they are allowed, they will then definitely contribute, because it's very important for them to help themselves and their family. And as UNHCR, we help them to help themselves, yeah. So I think that, I don't know if that answered to most questions, because some of parts of the questions I was not really clear.
Oh, one of her questions about how if the refugee status determination being declined, what happened to the asylum seeker?
Okay, so if they were rejected at the first instance, they will still have the right to appeal. 30 days after they were notified the first instance decision, they can appeal. So at the appeal stage, they will get a different legal officer or caseworker, and also a different reviewing officer. Once it is rejected again at the appeal stage, the decision has become final. Their case will be closed, and basically they, immigration law can be enforced to them, including being returned to their country. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Kang Isa. Then we go to the next questions from Gregory. It's about the role or mandate of the UNHCR. Does the UNHCR has the mandate or obligation to supervise the treatment on repatriated refugee?
Sorry, I'm just trying to...
From Gregory, under the chat from Angela.
Okay.
The mandate of UNHCR to supervise the treatment of repatriated refugees?
Okay, yeah, we do. So basically, we call them returnees. So we do still have some role in assisting and protecting them. For instance, when the refugees decided to return to their country of origin, usually in Indonesian context, we do the joint counseling with IOM. From UNHCR, we're going to brief them about their current situation of their country of origin, because we wanted them to make an informed decision that they will still return to their country despite all this. And IOM will then do the logistical support from the, what do you call it, the tickets, as well. So there's some kind of like we call it voluntary repatriation financial package, so for them to use that when they restart their lives in back in their country of origin. So when they are returned to their country of origin, so the UNHCR and IOM in those countries will also have some roles to help and to reintegrate the refugees back to their society. Until they are fully reintegrated, so then we somehow provided to some extent assistance as well. And also the one that I mentioned when it comes to the financial package, usually it is given when they are arrived in the country of origin, not before.
Thank you, Kang Isa, because already highlighting the role of UNHCR. But I forgot that there's also one remaining question from the previous student. It's about how the UNHCR get the budget for dealing with refugee. I think the question is about how you manage because there's a lot of refugee, and where is the source of the budget for dealing with refugee, in particular in Indonesia?
Yeah, so we have what we call it country donors, actually under the platform of the UN General Assembly, and as well as we have this what we call it executive committee, that they have the authority to approve UNHCR's budget every year, if I'm not mistaken. So UNHCR has the responsibility to propose the budget that we need for the coming years, and then they will then approve it, whether exactly the same amount that we wanted or less, usually less than what we wanted. So this is the reason that UNHCR, not all UNHCR country offices, but in Indonesia, we also have what we call it private sector partnership. So UNHCR in Indonesia also is allowed to find our own money to support our operation in Indonesia through private donors, and also in Indonesia we have cooperation started actually have a cooperation with the what do you call it, Basnas, the Zakat organization, because we also see Indonesia as, you know, the largest Muslim country. Zakat was never really being considered as a financial, one of the financial resources that could actually eventually help the refugees, and we are doing that now. So yeah, the donors, the country donors, they are there, but also at the same time UNHCR, not in all country offices, but like in Indonesia, we can also find our own money to for our operations.
Okay, so dealing with refugee always we have to like have the international cooperation with others. So it's a common issue. Not because I always say to my student that dealing with refugees, we cannot settle one issue only. For example, in ASEAN, only Malaysia or only Thailand, but we have to work together to dealing with this refugee that exists in Asian region. So we go to another question from Areta. The question is about it is urgent, or the urgency to ratify the refugee convention as well as the protocols. Yeah, considering the current social economic condition, and also if we ratify the refugee convention as in particular, we will have another burden that we have to provide some basic rights to refugee beside our own national. Or how do you respond to that questions?
Yeah, exactly what Taira, what you just said actually. So for us, yes, there's still an urgency for Indonesia by the 1951 convention, because, you know, the purpose that we have now is not really rights-based. And if we ratify the 1951 convention, we will have a more rights-based legal framework when it comes to refugee protection. Because as you know, in the 1951 convention, it contains lots of details and elaboration of what the refugee have when it comes to rights. Yeah. From even freedom of religion, from freedom of movement and all that. And we don't have that now. So I think there is still an urgency in Indonesia to have or, you know, to ratify the 1951 convention. But at the same time, you know, we leave this to Indonesian government to decide when. I hope that it's when, it's not if, because some countries they even decided not to ratify the 1951 convention, but they are considering to draft a national asylum law because they feel that it is more relevant to them for their local context and how they are protecting the refugees, and of course with adopting international principles that are contained in different international treaties. That country that I mentioned is Pakistan. Pakistani government has been saying that they don't need to ratify the 1951 convention.
They create their own regulation. That's
we are drafting the national asylum system, national asylum law actually. It's not being endorsed as a law, but they are going to that direction. Although UNHCR perspective, we want more countries, including Indonesia, to ratify the 1951 convention.
Okay, thank you. That's a new perspective. We have to like create our own law rather than ratify. And I also remember, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2008 something, the agenda to ratify refugee convention actually have already inserted into National Human Rights Action Plan, but by the time it's like a gone with the wind. I don't know, the agenda is there, but still until now we haven't ratified this convention. So we because actually we have time at beginning. The schedule is at until 11. Do you think it's okay if we extend like 15 minutes?
No problem, thank you.
Okay, to finish, I think there's two more questions. Oh, no, three. Okay, we go to Melania. Yes.
Thank you, Ibu Ira and Pak Isa for the opportunity. So I'd like to ask three questions. The first question is, in case of war where the situation is unsafe for people and they have the option to leave their country, how to protect refugees who are prohibited from their country of origin to fleeing abroad because of the contrary to the national interests of the states, which is contained in Article 35 of the Geneva Convention 4. And the second question is, in the case of refugees from Sudan and others who are tossed around in the Mediterranean Sea, which can lead to their death, but they are not accepted in the destination country, and they are in danger of being returned to their country of origin, what can be done about them? Because some of the rescue boats were even arrested because they are considered to be rescuing smugglers or illegal refugees. What are the obligations of passing ship? Because not all cargo ships passing by are willing to help them, especially because of economic consideration, because they will get the economic loss because they have to settle the documents of the refugees at the port they are going to. And the third question is, in the case of the European refugee crisis, what is the contribution of UNHCR to European countries? What advice do they give? The consideration that the large number of refugees also brings two sides to the countries there, especially the bad side, namely the increase in crime and security consideration for the European Union countries. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melania, for the questions. Like so many good questions today. It's very. I'm so proud with Unpad. Seriously, I mean, because I have been given the same presentation in other law schools, and the questions that I received today is just incredibly difficult. But maybe just to start to answer some of the questions from Melania. So I think when it comes to preventing to leave the country of origin, I think there will be many actors within the country of origin, that could actually highlight the human rights situation, the persecution against minority groups or anyone, that could be at risk of that, and then compel them to flee and seek a refuge in other countries. I think when it comes to UNHCR's role in this, especially in that country of origin, will be probably minimal. To be very honest, in Indonesia, we have been approached by different minority groups in Indonesia that wanted to get asylum from UNHCR in Indonesia, but we cannot, because UNHCR Indonesia can only assess the asylum application from non-Indonesian nationals. Then of course, if they think that Indonesia is too insecure for them, for whatever reasons that they have, we advise them first, they can get some kind of like protection from human rights actors in Indonesia, the NGOs, the legal aid, and if they have exhausted all that, they have the decision also to leave Indonesia and seeking asylum in other countries. Fortunately, when it comes to Indonesia, I don't think there is prevention for anyone to go. But in some countries, yes. And it's becoming very difficult. You may know countries like North Korea, basically not even allowing their citizens to leave for whatever reason. So that's becoming very difficult, especially those who are deserving international protection. So I think what we can do, whether UNHCR, whether UNOHCR, NGOs, or other governments, just need to highlight the human rights situation in those countries, and see if there should be an improvement when it comes to human rights protection in those countries. I think we do have all the obligations to do that. You mentioned about the Mediterranean refugee crisis. What UNHCR has been doing, especially when it comes to refugee protection context in Europe, because in Europe it's a different role that UNHCR is doing compared to what we are doing here in Indonesia. Of course, the EU countries, they have ratified the convention, then they also have the European Convention on, related to seeking asylum, seeking refuge, and you may be aware there's also this Dublin Convention, basically, that enforced in all the EU countries that they need to seek asylum in the first country of entrance, right? And if they move forward, they can be returned to the first European country that they entered. So what UNHCR is doing, we are making sure basically the access to asylum is respected by the EU countries, and the fair RSD access to legal aid, legal representative in their RSD also should be fulfilled to anyone seeking asylum in Europe or in European countries in particular. So yeah, I think when it comes to what happened in Europe, again, the role is very much different what we are doing here in Indonesia, but also just to give you an idea. So their best practices happen even in non-European countries when it comes to refugee protection. So I think this also needs to be taken into consideration, because I think there is less appreciation when developing countries are helping the refugees. And I think this needs to be highlighted all the time, because despite all the challenges that we have, including Indonesia and other developing countries, but we still are giving assistance and protection to the refugees. That I don't know if that answered, because there are so many sub questions that you asked, but I hope that I responded to at least most of them.
Thank you, Kang Isa. Hope you are not exhausted because a lot of questions raised by the students. And I think we have remaining two questions remaining from Lamboy. To make it short, I will just make a summary from the question. I think it's about the so-called climate change refugee, because it has been discussed that actually a person that flew from their home country due to climate change cannot be categorized as refugee. So it's still, there's an ongoing debate on this so-called natural disaster or environmental refugee. But the question is about how UNHCR certified the people that flew from their home country because of the climate change to have a better life, and how the reality of UNHCR practice to implement what IR International Refugee Law, or helping job in natural disaster and climate factor in Indonesia. I think the point is about the climate refugee, climate change refugee or environmental refugee. Is it under the mandate of UNHCR or not?
Thank you so much for the question. So yes, there has been lots of discussion about climate change and refugee protection, environmental refugees and all that within, the academia, within the refugee law practitioners, but as I understand, so far, there is still no consensus or convention or legal framework has been drafted, endorsed, basically to expand the definition of refugees under the 1951 Convention. So what UNHCR is doing, well, I personally have not really dealt with any climate change refugees, but it would be very difficult, of course, to stretch that one of the convention grounds to climate change argument. But what we see so far is that usually when it comes to climate change, natural disasters, the most affected ones have always been the most vulnerable ones, you know, whether the ethnic minorities, whether the women, whether the children, you know, and all that. And that can be somehow the nexus to one of the convention grounds under the 1951 Convention. And we are doing that, you know. So there is no refugee so far has been granted because of what you mentioned, based on climate change or natural disaster. But we always trying to find the nexus to one of the convention grounds. And again, the most affected ones, always the minority ones, you know. The privileged ones usually will not be as affected as the vulnerable ones, and they can find assistance or have their own assistance somewhere else. Yeah.
And usually also from the theoretical perspective, if there's no, it doesn't mean that they cannot be protected because there's a complementary protection under international human rights law. So there's no specific, or they cannot be, I think, included as to fulfill the requirement of refugee, but still international human rights like can give a protection to their basic rights. Okay, because we are running out of time, so this is our last questions from Laura. She's my master student, and she asked about the question about the role of our organization ASEAN in protecting refugee, especially dealing with Rohingya refugee, and it in fact the majority of the Asian member state is not ratifying the refugee convention, and she asked about how ASEAN actually can do or can handle the situation of refugee from Myanmar or Rohingya refugee.
No, thank you for the question. That brings us back also to the regional context, because UNHCR in particular, we are increasing our engagement with ASEAN. And you know, ASEAN has the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, where the right to seek asylum is recognized. And even in 2019, ASEAN issued they call it Declaration on Child Protection in the context of migration, that it also recognizes children in the context of those who are seeking asylum, refugees, IDPs, and all that. So there are different, we call it, of course, soft laws from ASEAN to have better protection for the refugees, not only the Rohingyas, of course, but anyone in Southeast Asia. And we also have seen the growing interest from, you may know the ICHR, I don't have to pronounce that, the ASEAN Governmental on Human Rights Commission. They also put so much interest now on refugee issues, like in the regional context. And of course, we should not forget about the Bali process that has been initiated a long time ago and still ongoing, where Indonesia is, I think, the co-chair, one of the co-chairs, together with other countries. So there are different platforms that actually are quite progressive in Southeast Asia. But you know, when it comes to the enforcement, maybe there's another question. But you know, but I think there will be more actors could actually help or jointly help each other to, you know, for better protection for the refugees in Southeast Asia. When it comes to the Rohingyas, especially when you mention about the pushback and all that, unfortunately, you know, what happened so far and what has been happening so far. And of course, ASEAN will not take any action against it, you know, because it's, you know, ASEAN loves non-interference principle, right?
Asian way is something.
But yeah, that's why it is very important non-government actors, UN agencies, to actually take the lead in complaining, you know, and in reminding the ASEAN countries about their human rights obligation. And I really agree with you when it comes to Rohingya refugees. That needs to be a regional political solution. it's not only Indonesia, it's not only Malaysia, or it's not only Thailand, because the Rohingyas are coming from Southeast Asia, and whatever happened in Myanmar is still happening, so they still cannot go back to Myanmar. And I think Indonesia, as de facto leader of ASEAN, I guess, Indonesia can take more role to actually, I don't know, pressurizing the ASEAN, or sorry, the Myanmarese government for the Rohingyas basically to be able to safely return, and they are given, you know, citizenship and access to basic rights. When this is non-existent, which what it is now, they will not go back. And this happens to other refugees, unless that the reasons why they fled their country is not stopped or ended, they will still be away from their country of origin, not knowing when they can go back. Yeah.
Thank you, Kang Isa, and I will give the opportunity, a last question from the lecturer, or perhaps Pak Imam want to greet his classmate.
Bu Ira, maybe I have kind of
Short, very short.
yeah, short. Isa, I just want to know how you cope with this. I mean, UNHCR in particular, because what we know that the regulations, many regulations in Indonesia and policy how to treat the refugee is like a contrary to each other. Not really contrary, but like not in line, and then but it makes the confusion for the people who are in the field. If I do my research with the officers in field, they get confused. So what they do basically is based on the humanitarian reasons. Ya, kita tolong aja because all of the things we just give it to the UNHCR and government. So how you cope with this, like the immigrations versus the refugees and etc. Thank you, Isa.
Thank you, Theorin. I think that's a very important question, because I think I don't think I mentioned this in my presentation, because, you know, we do have a regular and close coordination with the government, you know, as per the presidential regulation. So there is this National Refugee Task Force was established. It's under the Menko Polhukam, the coordinating ministry for political, legal, and security affairs. We have different platforms where we sit down and discuss, evaluate the enforcement or the implementation of the Perpres 1 to 5. The thing is, Perpres, in UNHCR perspective, is a really good start. And again, no countries in Southeast Asia, those who have not ratified the convention, have the same legal framework. There's nothing like this in Malaysia. There's nothing like this in Thailand. So what we have for press is actually a good start, and it needs to be probably expanded more, as I mentioned before, rights-based. And what it is important to respond to what Theorin said is actually to disseminate this legal framework to the whole government agencies in Indonesia's archipelago, because, you know, even the Perpres, who is now 5 years old since 2016, but still, you know, you will find immigration personnel or different government agencies in other locations in Indonesia have no idea about this Perpres, you know. And then, you know, when the circular letter from the Ministry of Education was enacted, many people also do not know. Many Dinas Pendidikan, you know, the education office also is no idea about this. So I think that is probably what UNHCR, government, and different other actors need to do to disseminate the whole, what Theorin mentioned, the pro-refugee policies in Indonesia. Start with that, while at the same time, you know, continuously we are advocating for greater access to basic rights for the refugees. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kang Isa, and allow me to take privilege to speak in bahasa. Karena kayaknya udah pegel ini 2 jam. Baik, terima kasih Kang Isa atas diskusi yang sangat menarik, dan pasti ini akan menginspirasi mahasiswa, khususnya mungkin mahasiswa yang memang belum mendapatkan mata kuliah hukum pengungsi, dan tadi Bu Orin sudah langsung terinspirasi untuk bagaimana kalau kita offer mata kuliah ini. Rasanya belum, Bu Orin, karena pengajarnya baru 1. Baik, mungkin ada dari Bapak Ibu dosen ada yang mau disampaikan, karena saya tidak akan mencoba mengkonklud karena kita bahasannya sudah sangat komprehensif, discussion-nya juga sangat mendalam, dan diharapkan kita mendapatkan gambaran bagaimana sebenarnya di lapangan ketika berhadapan dengan pengungsi, setelah juga kita mendapatkan materi di kelas. Dan ini juga menjadi kuliah penutup untuk mata kuliah hukum pengungsi internasional untuk master students, mahasiswa-mahasiswa saya. Terima kasih sudah mengikuti perkuliahan selama 1 semester dan mudah-mudahan mendapatkan manfaat. Dan diskusi hari ini oleh Kang Isa mudah-mudahan juga menginspirasi dan juga menginspirasi para mahasiswa semuanya mungkin bekerja menjadi atau menjadi humanitarian workers itu kan panggilan jiwa ya. Dan saya terus itu salah satu mimpi saya, tapi saya tidak berhasil mencapainya dan pastinya akan bisa berbuat sesuatu untuk kemanusiaan. Baik, terima kasih semuanya Bapak dan Ibu dosen yang sudah meluangkan waktu juga. Mungkin ini ada sedikit sertifikat, bukan token of appreciation, jadi sertifikat atas nama Kepala Departemen, Ketua Departemen Profesor Atif Latiful Hayat. Kami mengucapkan terima kasih pada Kang Isa Soemawidjaja atas perkenannya sebagai narasumber dalam sharing session yang insya Allah akan diadakan secara frequently, jadi nanti mungkin Bu Orin akan hubung lagi kalau disuruh ngajar lagi. Terima kasih semuanya, dan ini juga bisa dilihat nanti rekamannya di YouTube channelnya di Indonesian Center for International Law. Di sana kita sudah mendokumentasikan berbagai macam acara yang dilaksanakan oleh center di HI. Terima kasih banyak Kang Isa. Jangan bosan, nanti insya Allah kami akan undang kembali untuk mengajar di kelas kami. Terima kasih semuanya.